She agreed to marry a stranger by mail, then saw him waiting at the station. The letter was already written. Marta had read it 4 times, folded it, unfolded it, and read it again. The words were plain and short. A man named Arthur Cole, a widower living in Montana, was looking for a woman willing to start a new life with him. He had a homestead, a cow, a 4-year-old daughter who had not spoken in 6 months, and a wood stove that worked on most mornings. He did not ask for beauty. He did not promise love. He said he needed someone capable and honest, and that if she wrote back, he would answer. Marta Voss was 27 years old. She lived in a room at the back of her brother's farmhouse in South Dakota, a room so small she could touch both walls if she stretched her arms wide. She had been living there for 2 years, ever since she had come home to help when her mother fell ill. Her mother had died the following spring. Her brother Owen had kept her on to cook and clean. He never said it out loud, but she understood the arrangement. She was useful, that was enough. She was not ungrateful. Owen was not a cruel man. He fed her and let her stay, but she had turned 27 with no plans and no future that looked different from the one she was already living. She had watched the days go by like pages of a book with nothing written on them. She was not unhappy exactly. She was hollow, and that felt worse. The advertisement had appeared in the Lutheran Herald on a Tuesday. She had read it twice at the kitchen table while Owen was out in the field. She had torn it out and pressed it into the pocket of her apron. She had carried it for 3 days before she sat down and wrote her reply. She did not tell Owen. She wrote 2 full drafts before she was satisfied. She told Arthur Cole that she was in good health, that she could cook and keep a house, that she had grown up on a farm and was not afraid of hard work. She told him she was honest, as he had asked. She told him she was looking for a fresh start and was serious about it. She signed her name, sealed the envelope, and walked to town herself to mail it on a Thursday morning. She said she was going to buy thread. His reply came 11 days later. She recognized his handwriting immediately, even though she had only seen it once. It was slow and careful, the kind of handwriting that did not rush. He thanked her for writing. He said her letter was the most sensible one he had received, and that he had received 7. He said he would like to continue the conversation if she was willing. She was willing. They wrote to each other for 4 months. His letters came every 2 weeks, sometimes every 10 days. Hers went out the same way. She never told Owen about any of it. She received the letters herself, walking to town on the days she expected them, buying something small so the trips looked ordinary. Arthur was not a romantic writer. He did not fill his letters with poetry or grand words. He described his days plainly. He told her what the weather was like, how the land lay, what the spring had looked like after a long winter. He told her about his daughter Nora, who had been the happiest child imaginable before her mother died, and who now moved through the house like a small, quiet shadow, watching everything and saying nothing. In his 5th letter, he told Marta what had happened to his wife, Alina. She had gone into labor 6 months ago on a day when the snow came down so fast that by the time anyone could ride for the doctor, it was already too late. He had lost her and the baby both. He wrote this in 2 sentences without drama, and then moved on to talk about the fence he was mending. Marta sat at the kitchen table and read those 2 sentences 5 times. She understood then what kind of man he was. He was not a man who talked about pain. He was a man who buried it under work and kept going. She recognized that quality the way you recognize a face you have seen in a mirror. She wrote back that she was sorry about Alina. She said it simply, without trying to make it more than it was. She said she imagined Nora was lucky to have a father who kept the house warm and the fences standing. Arthur's next letter came back faster than usual. He said her reply was the kindest thing anyone had written to him in a long time. By the 6th letter, she knew she would say yes when he asked. He asked in the 7th. He did not make it dramatic. He said he believed they understood each other well enough to give it a fair try. He said he would send a train ticket if she agreed. He said he would understand if she did not. He said the ticket was already purchased and enclosed. The ticket fell out of the envelope and onto the kitchen table. Marta picked it up. She turned it over. Billings, Montana, November 14th. She sat very still for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside, Owen was chopping wood. The sound came in through the walls in slow, even beats. She put the ticket in the pocket of her apron, next to where she had kept the original advertisement. She did not write back to confirm. She simply began preparing to go. She packed her 1 trunk over the course of a week, doing a little each day so Owen would not notice. She took her winter coat, her 2 good dresses, her mother's Bible, a small tin of buttons she had collected since she was a girl. She took her sewing kit and her hairbrush and a photograph of herself at age 16 that she had never liked but carried because it was the only one she had. She told Owen the morning she left. She came down before sunrise and made breakfast as usual. She set his plate on the table and stood by the window and told him she was leaving that day, that she was getting married, that she had arranged it herself and the details were settled. Owen stopped eating. He looked at her. She answered the question he did not ask. She told him the man's name was Arthur Cole, that he lived in Montana, that she had been writing to him for 4 months, and she was confident in her decision. Owen was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if she needed money for the journey. She said the ticket was already paid for. He nodded. He looked back at his plate. He picked up his fork. She understood that he was not angry. She understood that he was also, somewhere under his silence, a little relieved. The farm was smaller without her help in it, but it was also more fully his. She did not blame him for that. She understood it. He drove her to the station himself. He carried her trunk up to the platform without being asked. He stood beside her while she waited, and they talked about small things: the weather, the new calf that had been born the week before, whether Owen should repair the barn roof before the real cold came or wait until spring. They talked like two people who had lived in the same house for 2 years and were now standing at the edge of something neither of them knew how to name. The train came. Owen picked up her trunk and handed it to the porter. He turned to Marta and looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Then he put his hand briefly on her shoulder, gave it one firm pat, and stepped back. She climbed onto the train. She found her seat. She put her bag on the rack above and sat down and looked out the window. Owen was still on the platform. He raised one hand when the train began to move. She raised hers. Then the station was gone, and South Dakota was going by outside the window, flat and wide, and already turning brown with the coming cold. She had never been on a train before. She pressed her hand flat against the seat beside her to feel the vibration of the engine moving through everything. The sound was enormous and steady, like the whole world had decided to go somewhere at once. She watched the land move past and did not let herself think too far ahead. She had made her choice. The ticket was in her coat pocket. The trunk was below in the luggage car. There was nothing left to decide. She thought about Nora, the silent 4-year-old, moving through a cold house like a small ghost. She thought about what it meant for a child to stop talking. She had known children who were quiet by nature. This was different. A child who had spoken freely and then stopped was not quiet by nature. She was quiet by grief. That was a thing Marta understood in her bones. Her own father had died when she was 9. She had not stopped speaking, but she had stopped singing. She had been a child who sang constantly, around the house, in the yard, on the way to school. After her father died, the singing stopped, just stopped, and she had not noticed until years later when her mother mentioned it. She looked out at the land going by. The train moved west as the afternoon darkened. The woman across the aisle had a young son who kept standing on the seat to look out the window. The boy's mother pulled him down and he climbed back up, and she pulled him down again. The boy did not seem frustrated. He seemed like he understood that looking out the window was worth the inconvenience of being pulled down. Marta watched this small negotiation and felt something warm and quiet move through her. She thought about Arthur's handwriting, slow and careful, not rushing. She thought about how he had described Aliner's death in 2 sentences and then written about a fence. She thought about the ticket he had purchased before she agreed. She did not know what that meant. She thought maybe it meant he was practical, that he had worked out the math of the situation and decided to commit early. She thought maybe it meant something else. She was not going to decide which one yet. Outside, the light was going. The land turned from brown to gray to dark. Stars appeared over Montana. She had heard the sky was bigger here. She looked out the window and thought that was not quite the right way to say it. The sky was not bigger. There was simply less in the way of it. She folded her coat into a pillow and pressed it against the window and closed her eyes. She slept and she did not dream, and in the morning the train was still moving west and the land outside was enormous and cold and completely new. And Marta Voss, who was practical and honest and hollow in a way she had been trying not to examine, opened her eyes and watched it go by and thought, quietly, that this might be the bravest thing she had ever done. Or the most foolish. She honestly could not tell the difference yet. The second night on the train was harder than the first. Marta had used up her bread and the small portion of cheese she had packed, and she was hungry in a way that felt personal, like the hunger was making a point. The dining car cost money she had decided to save. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the dark land go by and reminded herself that she had been hungry before and had not died of it. The woman across the aisle, whose name turned out to be Helen, noticed at some point during the evening that Marta had not eaten. She did not ask. She simply produced a biscuit from somewhere inside her coat and held it out without comment. Marta looked at it, then she took it and thanked her. Helen was traveling to Oregon to live with her sister. Her husband had left 2 years ago and had not come back, and she had been working at a laundry ever since, and finally she had decided that working at her sister's bakery was a better life than the one she was living. She told all of this to Marta in about 4 minutes, cheerfully and without any self-pity, while her sons slept across both their laps. Marta told her she was going to Montana to get married. Helen looked at her with genuine curiosity and asked if she knew the man. Marta said they had been writing to each other for 4 months. Helen thought about this. She said 4 months of letters was more than some people got. She said her own husband had courted her in person for 6 months, and she had still ended up sitting on a train to Oregon alone. She said letters at least gave you time to think. Marta thought that was a very reasonable thing to say. She slept better that second night with the boy's weight warm across her lap, anchoring her to the seat. She arrived in Billings on a gray November morning with a neck that ached from 2 nights upright and a coat that needed brushing and a heart that was doing something she could not quite classify. She stood up before the train fully stopped. She smoothed her dress. She put on her hat. She breathed in once slowly, and then she picked up her bag and walked to the door. The platform was busy. People coming and going, luggage being hauled, a dog barking somewhere to the left. Cold air hit her the moment she stepped down, clean and sharp and smelling of coal smoke and open land. She stood on the platform and looked. She was not sure how she would recognize him. He had never described himself. She had not thought to ask for a physical description, and he had not offered one. She had assumed she would figure it out when she got there. Now, standing on the platform with her bag at her feet and strangers moving around her in every direction, she was less confident about that assumption. She looked for a man standing alone. There were several. There was a man in a dark coat near the station door, reading a paper. There was a younger man sitting on a bench with his boots stretched in front of him, watching the arrivals. There was a man at the far end of the platform who was not reading and not sitting. He was standing still, holding his hat in both hands, turning it slowly in his fingers the way a person does when they have too much nervous energy and no acceptable way to spend it. He was looking at every woman who stepped off the train. Marta did not move yet. She stood where she was and watched him look. He had a broad face, not particularly handsome, not plain either, just a face that looked like it had seen a great deal of weather and was not bothered by it. He was taller than average. His coat was clean but old. His boots were practical. He looked at her. She did not look away. He went very still. His hands stopped turning the hat. She picked up her bag and walked toward him. With every step she was aware of things in a way she was not usually aware of them. The sound of her own boots on the platform, the weight of the bag in her hand, the distance between herself and this man closing in a way that could not be undone. She had spent 4 months reading his handwriting. She had spent 4 months building an idea of who he was from words on paper. And now the paper was gone and the man was standing in front of her, and he was real in a way that paper never is, breathing and uncertain and turning his hat again, slowly, because she had started walking and he did not know what to do with his hands. She stopped in front of him. He said her name the way someone says a word they have been practicing, not uncertain exactly, just careful, like he wanted to get it right. She said his. They stood looking at each other for a moment that went on longer than politeness usually allowed. She noticed his eyes were a dark gray, the same color as the sky behind him. She noticed a small scar on his chin, the kind that comes from farm work and not from drama. She noticed that he had shaved that morning carefully, and that there was a small place near his jaw where he had not quite gotten it even. He said with no introduction or preamble, "My daughter does not talk much." She said, "Neither do I." Something moved across his face, not a smile. The thing that happens before a smile, when a person realizes that the thing they were afraid of might not be as frightening as they thought, a small relaxing around the eyes, a breath let out slowly. He said, "I have the wagon outside," and then, as if catching himself, he said, "I am glad you came." She said, "I am glad I did." She meant it. She was surprised to find she meant it. Standing on that cold platform in Billings, with her neck still aching and her coat needing a brush and her whole life packed into a trunk she had not yet located, she was genuinely, quietly glad. He picked up her trunk himself when the porter brought it. He did not hand it off or wait for help. He simply picked it up and carried it, and she followed him through the station and out to a wagon pulled by a bay horse that turned to look at her with large, unhurried eyes. Arthur put the trunk in the back and then turned and looked at her for a moment, as if remembering something. He said the drive to the homestead was about 2 hours. He said the road was not always smooth, but it was passable. He said there was a blanket on the seat if she was cold. She said she was fine. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. He climbed up on the other side and took the reins, and they left the station without any further ceremony. The town gave way to road, and the road gave way to land, enormous and brown and going on forever in every direction, and Marta sat beside a man whose handwriting she knew better than his face and watched Montana open up around her like a question she had not been asked yet. They did not talk much on the drive. This did not feel uncomfortable. It felt like two people who both understood that some things did not need to be talked around. They talked a little about the land and a little about the winter coming, and Arthur pointed out a ridge to the north and said the house was just past it. He said it as if he was confirming a fact, not making a promise. She liked that. She had had enough of promises. She was interested in facts. The house appeared past the ridge the way Arthur had said it would, a low wooden building with a stone chimney and a barn behind it and a yard that was bare and clean. Smoke was coming from the chimney. She noticed that and thought someone must be inside. Arthur said he had asked his neighbor, old Mr. Hayward, to watch Nora while he came to the station. He said Nora would be inside. Marta sat up slightly. The wagon stopped in front of the house. Arthur jumped down and came around to her side and held out his hand to help her down. She took it. His hand was cold from holding the reins in the November air, but it was steady. They went up to the door together. Arthur pushed it open and Marta stepped inside. The room was warm. There was a fire going. Mr. Hayward, a very old man with a white beard, was sitting by the fire in a chair that looked like it had been his for decades. He stood when they came in, nodded to Marta with the specific politeness of someone who has been told a situation is complicated and has decided not to comment on it, and said he would be going home now. He put on his coat and left. And then there was quiet, the fire, the room, Arthur standing just behind Marta's shoulder. And in the doorway of the back room, partly in shadow, a small girl with dark hair standing very still, looking at Marta with large, serious eyes. Marta did not rush toward her. She did not crouch down and speak in a high, sweet voice the way adults did when they were trying to seem less frightening to children and instead seemed more frightening. She simply stood where she was and looked back at Nora the same way Nora was looking at her, quietly, without expectations. Nora did not move. Marta said hello, Nora, just that, in the same voice she would use to speak to anyone, no performance in it. Nora looked at her for another long moment, then she retreated back into the shadows of the back room, not running, walking, slowly as if she wanted to make sure she had made her own decision about it. Arthur said quietly from behind Marta, "That is the most she has reacted to anyone new in 4 months." Marta nodded. She was looking at the doorway where Nora had been. She thought about her own singing that had stopped at 9 and not come back for years. She thought, we have time. Arthur showed her the house. It was small and plain and very clean. She understood the cleanliness was intentional. He had made an effort. The kitchen was organized, the floor swept, the windows clear. On the table was a small bunch of dried wildflowers in a glass jar. They were not fresh. They were the kind that had been dried on purpose to be kept. She looked at them and said nothing. She wondered how long they had been there. She wondered if Eleanor had picked them. She did not ask. He showed her where things were. The kitchen, the pantry, the small room where Nora slept, the larger room that was his. He said carefully, without looking at her directly, "I put a cot in the back room by the kitchen." He said she was welcome to use it. He said there was no rush on any of it. He said he had arranged for the minister in town to come out the following week if she was agreeable, but that nothing was settled until she said it was. She looked at him. He was staring at a point somewhere past her shoulder, holding himself very straight, and she understood that this was a man who was doing everything he could think of to be decent and was not entirely sure he was managing it. She said, "That is very thoughtful, Arthur." He breathed out. She saw his shoulders lower slightly. She said, "I am agreeable." He nodded, he looked at his boots, he looked back at her. He said, I am going to see to the horse. He said there would be dinner when he came back. He said to rest if she needed to. He went outside. Marta stood alone in the kitchen of a house that was not yet hers and looked around at it, the dried flowers on the table, the wood stove that worked on most mornings, according to his very first letter, the door to the back room where Nora was. She took off her hat and hung it on the peg by the door. She went to the stove and opened it to check the fire. It needed wood. She went to the woodpile by the wall and took 3 pieces and added them. The fire caught and rose and threw heat into the room. She filled the kettle from the water barrel and set it on the stove. Then she sat down at the table and looked at the dried flowers and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of everything. The long train ride, the cold platform, the man who had stood there turning his hat, worried she would not recognize him, the little girl in the doorway who had looked at her with the eyes of someone who had learned that the world takes things away without asking. The kettle began to whisper. Marta got up and made tea. She made enough for 2 cups. When Arthur came back in from the barn, stamping cold from his boots at the door, she set one of the cups on the table for him. He stopped when he saw it. He looked at the cup and then at her. He sat down. They drank their tea on opposite sides of the table in the warm kitchen in the early dark of a Montana November, and they did not talk very much, and it was not uncomfortable, and outside the wind was beginning and the land was wide and cold in every direction, and inside the fire was going and the tea was hot, and somewhere in the back room a small girl who had decided not to speak was listening to 2 strangers share a quiet that felt already a little bit like a beginning. Marta woke before light on her first morning. The house was still and cold in the way a house gets before anyone has stirred the fire. She lay on the cot in the small back room and listened, whined outside low and steady, the tick of the wood settling in the walls. A sound from the back that might have been the horse in the barn. She got up. She dressed quickly, the cold finding every gap in the process. She pulled her hair back without a mirror and went to the kitchen and opened the stove and found coals still alive underneath the ash. She built the fire back up with careful hands, adding small pieces first, then larger ones, waiting for each layer to catch before she added the next. Her father had taught her that you could not rush a fire. The kitchen began to warm. She found flour and salt and a crock of lard and set to making biscuits. She did not know what Arthur's mornings looked like, what he usually ate, what time he started work. She had no information except that he had said he would make dinner the night before, and had in fact made a simple meal of potatoes and salt pork that was hot and plain and exactly what she needed after 2 days of train travel. She had eaten it at his table and said it was good and meant it. Now it was her turn. She mixed the biscuit dough by feel more than by measurement, the way she had done it 100 times in Owen's kitchen. She rolled it out on the floured board she found on the shelf below the counter. She cut the biscuits with the rim of a cup. She put them in the pan and set them on the top of the stove where the heat was steady. Then she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark yard. The barn was a black shape against a sky that was just beginning to lighten at the far edge. She could see the outline of the ridge Arthur had pointed to yesterday. Everything was very still. She thought about her room at Owen's farm. She thought about waking up in it morning after morning, knowing exactly what the day would look like before it started. She was not sure if what she felt right now was better than that, but it was different, and different was something. It was enough of something to have put her on a train. She heard a small sound behind her. She turned. Nora was standing in the doorway between her room and the kitchen, the same doorway where she had stood the night before. She was wearing a long sleeping gown and her feet were bare on the cold floor. Her hair was loose and somewhat tangled. She was looking at Marta with those large, serious eyes, and she looked in that moment very small and very young, which she was. Marta said good morning, same as the night before, the same voice she would use with anyone, no performance. Nora said nothing. Marta turned back to the stove and checked the biscuits. They needed a few more minutes. She said without looking at Nora, the floor is cold. She said it as a fact, not a command. She said, there are stockings on the chair by your bed if you want them. She heard nothing for a moment, then she heard small feet on the floor, retreating, then returning. When she looked back, Nora was in the doorway again, wearing stockings, still watching. Marta nodded as if this were perfectly ordinary. She said, do you want to watch the biscuits? Nora crossed the kitchen and stood beside the stove. Marta moved slightly to make room. Nora looked at the pan through the small gap in the stove door. Her face in the orange light was soft and very still. They stood like that until the biscuits were done. Marta lifted the pan and set it on the board to cool. She said, "They need a few minutes." She said, "Do not touch yet." Nora nodded, just once, a small nod, but a nod. Arthur came in from outside, just as the biscuits were cool enough to handle. He stopped at the kitchen door the same way he had stopped the night before when he saw the tea, as if he had prepared himself for a version of the morning that did not include warmth and biscuits, and his daughter standing at the stove without being carried there. He looked at Nora, he looked at Marta. He said good morning, he said it quietly. Marta said good morning and told him breakfast was ready. They ate at the table, the three of them. Nora sat in her chair and ate her biscuit carefully in small pieces, the way children do when they are serious about things. Arthur ate and said the biscuits were good. Marta said thank you. Outside the window the sky was fully light now, white and cold, and the yard was sharp and clear and going on into Montana in every direction. This was the beginning of the rhythm, not a pattern yet because patterns need more time, but the first beat of one. Arthur worked from before dawn to after dark. He told her on the second day what the work looked like, not to explain himself, but because he thought she needed to know in order to plan her own days. The property was 400 acres, most of it grazing land. He ran cattle, a small herd, and kept a kitchen garden in summer that was bare and sleeping now. He did all of the outside work himself. He said he sometimes hired help in the heavy seasons. He said the inside was hers to manage if she was willing. He said if there were things she wanted done differently, she should say so. She said she would let him know. She started learning the house. Every house has its own logic, the places where things are kept, the order that has built up over years of one person living in it alone. Arthur's logic was simple and practical. He had put things where they were easiest to reach. He had not organized for beauty. He had organized for efficiency, which she respected. She rearranged very little. She moved the flour to a lower shelf so she did not have to reach up for it, which she mentioned to him so it was not a surprise. She found a better hook for the lamp in the kitchen so it threw more light over the table. She did these things quietly and told him when she did them, and he said that was fine and seemed to mean it. Nora she did not try to manage. She let Nora come to the kitchen when she wanted, which was most mornings, and stay as long as she wanted, which was sometimes most of the morning. Marta did not push conversation. She talked out loud while she worked, not at Nora, but near her, the way some people talk to themselves. She said what she was doing. She said she was going to make soup and that she needed to find the onions. She said she thought the window on the south side let in more light than the north one. She said the dried flowers on the table were very pretty and asked, without looking at Nora, if Nora knew where they had come from. Nora said nothing. Marta said, "I think they are mountain flowers. I am not sure what kind." She went back to the soup. On the fourth day, Nora touched one of the dried flowers very lightly with one finger, just the tip of one petal. She looked at Marta. Marta nodded and said, "They are delicate. You can hold one if you like." Nora picked one up. She held it for a long time, then she put it back. Marta said nothing about it. That evening at dinner, Arthur asked how the day had gone. It was a simple question and she answered it simply. She said it had gone well. She said Nora had shown an interest in the flowers on the table. Arthur looked at Nora. Nora was eating her soup and not looking at anything in particular, but her ears were listening, Marta could tell. Arthur said quietly, "Those were Aliners." Marta nodded. She said, "They are well dried. They will last a long time." Arthur looked at the flowers for a moment. Then he looked at Marta and said, "Yes." Then he looked at his soup. The minister came on a Wednesday, 6 days after Marta arrived. He was a tall, thin man named Reverend Cobb, with a kind face and the air of someone who had done this sort of thing before and understood that it meant different things to different people, and was not his business to judge which meaning it had here. They stood in the kitchen, the three of them, with Nora sitting on her chair by the stove, watching everything with her usual careful attention. Reverend Cobb asked the necessary questions. He received the necessary answers. He said the words he was there to say. Marta repeated hers and Arthur repeated his, and then it was done. Reverend Cobb shook Arthur's hand and said he wished them both well. He bent down slightly to Nora and said she was a fine young lady. Nora looked at him the way she looked at everything, with total seriousness, and said nothing. He drank a cup of tea and talked to Arthur about the winter weather and left. Marta and Arthur stood in the kitchen after the sound of his wagon had faded. They were married, that was the fact of it now. Arthur said, "I will start earlier than usual tomorrow. The northern pasture fence needs work before the real cold comes." She said, "I will have breakfast ready before you go." He nodded, he picked up his coat and went to check on the barn. Marta stood alone in the kitchen that was hers now and looked at the dried flowers on the table and thought that this was, of all the ways a marriage might begin, possibly the most honest one she had ever heard of. Two people who needed something, writing letters, getting on trains, standing in a kitchen and saying words that meant they had agreed to try. No illusions dressed it up. No promises about things that could not be promised. Just the fire in the stove and the fence that needed mending and a child in the corner who was watching to see what kind of person Marta was going to turn out to be. She thought, I had better be someone worth watching. She started on dinner. The cold came down in the third week of November like it had been waiting just past the ridge, biding its time. Marta woke one morning to find frost on the inside of the kitchen window, fine white crystals that caught the early light and made the glass look like something valuable. She breathed on it to melt a small circle and looked out at the yard. The ground was iron-hard. The sky was white all the way to the horizon. She built the fire higher than usual. She made porridge because it held heat and was filling, and she put extra on for Arthur, who had already been out in the barn for an hour by the time she came downstairs. She knew his routine now. She could map his mornings by sound without looking out the window. The barn door, which had a particular sound to it, a long wooden drag across frozen ground, the rhythm of feeding. A shorter sound when he came back in to wash his hands at the outside pump. He came in just as the porridge was ready. He said good morning and washed and sat down, and she put the bowl in front of him without being asked. They had fallen into this without discussing it. Neither of them had designed it. It had just grown, the same way the morning routine had grown, because they were both practical people who paid attention. Nora came out in her stockings and sat in her chair. Marta put a smaller bowl in front of her. Nora looked at it and then began to eat. Arthur said, I need to ride to town today. He said there were supplies to get before the serious weather. He said it would take most of the day. Marta said, I can make a list if there are things needed for the kitchen. He said that would be helpful. She wrote the list after breakfast while Arthur finished his preparations. Flour, salt, dried beans, lamp oil, a new tin of baking powder because she had used the last of the old one. She added a small note that said the water barrel had a slow leak on the south seam in case he had time to get it seen to. She folded the list and gave it to him. He read it, he put it in his coat pocket. He said he would try to be back before dark. He left. The house was very quiet with just Marta and Nora in it. This happened sometimes when Arthur went to town, which was not often. The first time it had happened, Marta had felt the quiet more than she expected. The house was small enough that a person's absence changed the weight of the air inside it. She had not anticipated that. She had thought she would be used to quiet, having lived in Owen's back room for 2 years. But that quiet had been lonely. This quiet was different. Arthur's absence was a specific shape, and she found she noticed it. She did not tell him this. Nora that day was in the kitchen more than usual. She sat on her chair with a cloth doll that she had brought out from her room, a worn thing that had been loved past the point where you could tell what color it had originally been. She was not playing with it exactly. She was holding it and watching Marta move around the kitchen. Marta was baking bread. She talked out loud the same way she always did when she was working and Nora was nearby. She said she was starting with the water because the water needed to be warm but not hot, and that the difference mattered more than people thought. She said the yeast had to bloom before you added the flour or the bread would not rise properly. She said, do you want to see the yeast bloom? She asked it the same way she asked Nora anything, as if the question were ordinary and the answer was entirely optional. Nora got down from her chair. She came and stood beside Marta at the counter. She looked at the small cup of warm water where Marta had dropped in the yeast. They both watched it. The yeast began to foam and rise slowly in the warm water. Nora leaned forward slightly. Marta said, it means it is alive and working. She said, that is how you know the bread will be good. Nora looked at the foaming yeast for another moment. Then she looked up at Marta. It was the first time she had looked directly at Marta's face with something in her expression other than careful assessment. It was not a smile. It was something like interest, like she was revising an opinion. Marta looked back at her. She said, you can mix it in if you want. Nora reached into the bowl and stirred. Her small hand in the dough was serious and focused. Marta guided her without hovering, letting Nora feel the resistance of it, the way the dough pushed back and then gave. They made the bread together. Nora did more of it than Marta toward the end, and what she lacked in strength she made up in determination. When they put the dough in the bowl to rise and covered it with a cloth, Nora stood looking at the covered bowl for a moment, as if to make sure it understood what it was supposed to do. Marta had to look out the window so Nora would not see her face. Arthur came back as it was getting dark, a little later than he had said, which she had started to worry about without being able to fully explain the worry to herself. She heard the wagon and felt something in her chest release, which surprised her. She had thought she was not paying that kind of attention. She was. He came in and brought the cold in with him and set a large bundle of supplies on the kitchen table. He said the road had been slower than expected. He said the temperature had dropped on the way back. He said the water barrel would be seen to in the spring, that the barrel maker in town had said the seam would hold through winter if she did not fill it past 3/4. She said she would remember that. He looked at the kitchen and noticed the bread on the board cooling. He said, "You made bread." She said Nora helped. He looked at Nora, who was sitting in her chair again with her doll. His face did the thing it sometimes did, the small movement around the eyes, the slight adjusting of something held tight. He crouched down to Nora's eye level and said, "Did you?" Nora looked at him, she looked at the bread, she looked back at him. And then, in a voice that was very small and very careful and had not been used in 6 months, she said, "Yes." One word. Arthur went completely still. Marta was looking out the window at the dark yard. The fire in the stove made a small sound. The wind pressed against the walls. The bread sat cooling on the board. Arthur said just as carefully as Nora had, "Was it good?" Nora thought about this with great seriousness. Then she said, "Warm." Arthur made a sound that was not a word. He stood up slowly. He was facing away from Marta, toward the stove, and she could not see his face. He stayed facing that direction for a moment. She gave him that moment. She went to the stove and checked the fire. She said dinner would be ready in about half an hour. She set it to the stove, to no one in particular, and busied herself in a way that gave him room to be whatever he needed to be. When he turned around, his face was composed. He said that sounded good. He said he was going to wash up. He went to the back. Marta stood at the stove. She stirred the pot. She thought about what a person sounds like when they are trying not to cry and managing it through sheer will because she knew that sound. She had made it herself. She stirred the pot and said nothing and thought, something is growing here. She could not put a name to it yet. It was too new to name. But it was real, the way the yeast was real when it foamed and rose in the warm water, alive and working. Dinner that night was the quietest of all their dinners, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of 3 people who had all heard the same 2 words and were sitting with the weight of what they meant. Nora ate her dinner and said nothing further, which was fine. 1 word, then 2, that was enough for one day. Later, after Nora was in bed and Arthur had gone outside for a final check of the barn, Marta was washing the dishes alone in the kitchen. She heard the barn door. She heard his boots on the frozen ground. She heard the front door. He came and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. He said, "Thank you." She looked at him over her shoulder. She said, "I did not do anything in particular." He said, "Yes, you did." She turned back to the dishes. He said good night and went to bed. She finished washing the dishes and dried them and put them away and wiped down the counter and banked the fire for the night. She checked that the latch was secure on the front door. She went to the back room and the cot that was hers and took off her shoes and sat for a moment on the edge of it in the dark. She thought about Owen's back room, the 2 walls she could touch if she stretched, the days like blank pages. She thought about the yeast foaming in the warm water. She thought, "I think I did the right thing." She lay down and pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. Outside, the wind worked at the house and the land was cold and enormous in every direction, and inside the fire was banked and the bread was covered on the board, and a little girl who had not spoken in 6 months had said 2 words today, and Marta Voss, who was now Marta Cole, though it still felt strange to think it, lay in the dark and breathed steadily and was not hollow. Not quite. Not anymore. Spring in Montana came slowly and without announcement. One morning the frost on the kitchen window was thinner, then one morning it was gone. The ground that had been iron-hard through the worst of January and February began to soften at the edges, giving a little underfoot, and the sky changed from white to a pale gray blue that held more light. Marta noticed these things the way she noticed the house. quietly, without making them into occasions. Nora had begun to speak in earnest in January, not all at once, not in a flood that erased the months of silence, but in the careful way she did most things. One word here, a short sentence there. She spoke most often to Marta, which Marta understood without discussion. She was the new thing in the house. She was safe precisely because she did not carry the history that Arthur carried. Arthur loved Nora in the most complete way a person can love a child, but his love came with grief attached, and Nora was old enough in her bones, if not her words, to feel the weight of that. With Marta, there was no weight of that kind. There was just the bread and the stove and the dried flowers and the morning porridge, and a woman who talked out loud while she worked and never required Nora to be anything specific. By February, Nora was speaking in sentences. By March, she was asking questions. She asked about everything. She asked where the flour came from. She asked why the water barrel had a seam. She asked what the dried flowers were called. She asked why Marta's hair was a different color from Alina's, which she knew from the portrait on the bedroom shelf and which she said was very dark while Marta's was not. Marta answered everything plainly. She did not flinch at the question about Alina. She said she did not know, that it was just how she had been born, same as Nora's hair was dark and Arthur's was brown. She said some things were just the way they were. Nora accepted this with her customary seriousness. She had a habit, once she started talking, of asking questions at unexpected moments. She asked in the middle of breakfast whether the cow had a name. She asked in the middle of a walk to the barn whether stars were hot or cold. She asked, one evening while Marta was mending a torn seam on Arthur's work shirt, whether Marta was going to stay. Marta looked up from the shirt. Nora was sitting across the table with her cloth doll, which she still carried but treated now more like a companion than a comfort. She was looking at Marta with the directness that had been in her eyes from the beginning, before she spoke, before she warmed. Marta said, "Yes," she said, "this is my home now." Nora looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "Good." She went back to the doll. Marta went back to the mending. She thought about the word home. She had not been sure when it had happened. There had been no single moment she could point to where the house had changed from a place she was staying to a place she belonged. It had accumulated the same way the routine had accumulated. The hook for the lamp she had moved, the shelf where the flour was now, the specific sound of the barn door, the rhythm of Arthur's mornings. She had not built a home, she had grown into one. Arthur changed too through the winter. She observed this the way she had observed the frost on the window, steadily and without making it into something. He was less careful with her now, less formal, the stiffness of the early weeks having softened into something she did not yet have a word for. He talked more at dinner. Not much. He was still a man who used language sparingly, but more than he had. He talked about the cattle and the land, and occasionally he told her things about his past that were not in any letter, small facts offered without ceremony. He told her he had grown up in Vermont. He told her he had come west at 22 with his brother, and that his brother had gone back east after 2 years because the winters were harder than he had expected. He told her he had stayed, because by then the land had become something he could not imagine leaving. She told him about her father dying when she was 9. She told him about the singing stopping and not coming back. She said it simply, the way he said things, and he listened without pushing her for more, which she appreciated. One evening in late February, she was reading by the lamp, and he was at the table working through figures in his account book, and he looked up and said, without particular reason or introduction, "I think it is a good thing you answered." She looked up from her book. She said, "The advertisement." He said, "Yes." She said, "I think so too." He went back to his figures. She went back to her book. But she was not reading. She was thinking about what it meant that he had said that. She understood that for him it was not a small thing. He was a man who did not say things without meaning them. He was a man who weighed words before he committed them to paper or to air. And he had looked up from his account book on a February evening and said that he thought it was a good thing. She thought about the train ticket that had been in the envelope before she agreed. She had wanted to ask about that for months. She asked him that night. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his account book. He said, "I had read your letter 6 times. He said, "I knew before I finished the second read." She said, "Knew what?" He said that you were the one I was going to write back to. He said, the ticket seemed right. He said, "I thought if I sent it, it would say something that a letter might not." She thought about what it had said, that he had already decided, that he was not hedging, that he had taken the risk first without asking her to take it for him. She said it did. He closed the account book. He said good night. He went to bed. She sat by the lamp for a while longer. The fire was low. The house was quiet. She could hear the wind outside, gentler than it had been in January. Something slightly changed in it. She sat and thought about Vermont and a brother who had gone back east, about a man who had decided to stay, about a train ticket bought before an answer came. She thought he already knew. And there was something in that thought that she could not quite contain, something warm and inconvenient and real that moved through her chest without asking permission. She banked the fire and went to bed. Spring arrived. The kitchen garden went in during the second week of April, both of them working it together, Marta on her knees with the trowel and Arthur turning the soil with the spade. Nora helped in the way a 4-year-old helps, which is to say she moved dirt from one place to another with great concentration and asked questions that had no answers. She asked why seeds were so small if they grew into such large things. Arthur said he did not know. She found this unsatisfactory and turned to Marta, who said, "Some things start small." Nora looked at her. Marta said, "That does not mean they stay small." Nora considered this. Then she pushed a seed into the earth with one finger and patted the dirt over it firmly, as if making sure it understood the instruction. They worked until the light changed and the cold came back into the air the way it did in early spring, the warmth borrowed and temporary. Arthur stood and rolled his sleeves back down and looked at what they had done. He looked satisfied in the specific, private way of a person who is not used to acknowledging satisfaction out loud. Marta stood and brushed the dirt from her skirt. He said, "It is a good garden." She said, "It will be, yes." He looked at her. There was something in the way he looked at her that was not the same as the careful, formal way he had looked at her on the platform in November, or the polite, cautious way he had looked at her across the dinner table in December. It was more direct than that. It was the look of a person who has seen you in enough ordinary situations to have formed an opinion and has decided the opinion is a good one. She looked back. He said, "I am glad you stayed through the winter." She said, "I said I would." He said, "I know," he said, "people say things." She understood what he meant. He meant that people said things and then the winter came, the real Montana winter with its ice and dark and isolation, and some things that had seemed possible in November revealed themselves to be harder than expected. He had known that, he had wondered. She said, "I do not say things I do not mean." He said, "No," he said, "I know that now." They stood in the garden in the early spring evening, with the cold coming back into the air, and the seeds in the ground, and the house behind them throwing light from the kitchen window. He said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. He said, "I do not want this to be only an arrangement." He said it carefully, the way his handwriting was careful. He said, "I know that is what it was when we started. I know you came because you needed to, and I know I asked because I needed to." He stopped, he said, "But I think it has become something else." She said, "Yes." He said, "I wanted to say it out loud." She said, "I am glad you did." He looked at the gardens. He said, "All right." He said it the way he said most things, plainly and without drama, but there was something underneath it that she recognized because she had been feeling it herself for weeks and not naming it. She said, "All right." He picked up the spade, she picked up the trowel, they went inside. Nora was at the table with her doll and her endless questions, and the kitchen was warm and the bread from the morning was still on the board and everything was ordinary, and inside the ordinary, something had shifted into a shape that had a name now. She did not say the name out loud. She did not need to. I knew. She knew. The garden would grow. The seeds were small and the spring was cold, and neither of those things changed the fact that growth was already happening, had been happening for months, quiet and inevitable and rooted too deep now to be undone. Marta Cole stood in her kitchen and made dinner, and listened to her husband come in and wash his hands and her daughter ask whether a worm she had found in the garden was sleeping or thinking, and the fire was going and the land was wide outside, and the sky was enormous in the way she had noticed that first night on the train, so much sky and so little in the way of it. She had written a letter to a stranger. She had gotten on a train. She had stood on a cold platform in a hat she could not afford and walked toward a man turning his hat in his hands, and she had said his name and he had said hers. That was all it had been. That was how all of it had begun. And now this was her life, this kitchen and this man and this child who asked questions and this garden that would grow in the spring. And it was not what she had planned because she had not planned anything. She had simply moved toward a thing that might be better than the thing she had. And it had turned out to be not just better, but real, genuinely and completely real, in the way that only things you choose with your whole self ever are. Outside, the Montana sky did what it always did. It held nothing back. It went on in every direction, enormous and patient, wide enough for whatever came next. Inside, Marta stirred the pot. The fire was going. Nora, waiting for an answer about the worm, looked at her with those serious eyes and waited. Marta said, "I think it is thinking." Nora considered this. She said, "About what?" Marta thought for a moment. She said, "About spring." She said, "About what it is going to become." Nora was satisfied with this answer. She put the worm carefully on the windowsill and went back to her dinner. Marta looked at the worm on the windowsill. Then she looked out the window at the darkening sky. Then she looked at the room behind her, reflected faintly in the glass. The man at the table, the child, the fire. She smiled, not for anyone. Just because the feeling was there, and it was real, and she was done trying to hold it at a distance. She stirred the pot. She was home.